Okay, so we are broadcasting live on Facebook, and as Kevin just said, this is kind of part of our special series. We got some really just what I consider some of my favorite candidates and current electeds who will be basically sitting down and kind of having a discussion with us. So, Kevin, I'm gonna let you go ahead and get us started.
Well, Mr. Mike Weissman, as I tell everyone when I talk about you, that you are the hardest working legislator that I know, and you are my personal representative in the Colorado House of Representatives.
Mine too.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the hard work you do. We get thanks for what we do on the school board, but I want to say hats off to you for what you do for us down at the Capitol. So look, it's election season. Yes, sir. Of course. It's election season. We got how many days exactly until the election?
30.
Well, so let's see. Today is Thursday, which brings us to 33, I think. It depends on if you count the day itself. So we're down close enough to where you might hear slightly different numbers. Okay. See, I got an app that's given me 32 days and 11 hours. 32, 33, depending on how you reckon it.
Okay.
Of course, ballots go out a lot sooner than that.
Very true. The ballots are dropping. In 32 days and some change, imagine you get elected again. You get reelected, so you can term out as our House representative. What's going to be your top 2 or 3 policy points that you want to make sure happen for House District 36?
Wow. Okay. So I am lucky that if I win re-election here, I do get to run one last time for 2022. Not terming out yet.
Well, he's trying to get ready.
A lot of work undone here, but well, I mean, I guess I'll kind of start small, and then we got to look at the bigger context, because I think when you have the opportunity to be in public service, you have to look at context. We end up working together on things that intersect between the school board and the state legislative level. At the state level, we necessarily intersect with the city council. I'm sure you do too, and so forth. If we have an election that goes okay, and we have a change of who's president in this country, and there's an orderly transition, we know that we're still going to be dealing with COVID. We know that we're still going to be dealing with the COVID recession. And I think those are the top 2 that the legislature has to deal with. We have to continue to try to support an evidence-based, science-based, smart public health response. We're already seeing upticks around the country. I'm picking up just in the reading of the news that I do, more concerned about this. If you look at the national maps, we have been a lot better than almost every other state for months. And that is a testament to the fact that I think for the most part, we've tried to just keep our nose to the stone and follow the science and not get out too far too fast in a way that's going to snap back. We're seeing things in our college settings that those are issues that we need to manage. We know we're going to have to continue to manage that. You go back to March, April, people would already talk about, okay, we got to get through this first wave we're in. What about the second wave? Even back then, we were here in fall, winter. Another thing you hear is, look, every year there's a flu. And if you look at the numbers of how many people get sick with the flu and even how many people die from the annual flu that we don't talk about the way we talk about COVID, just because it's become something we're all used to. If you're older, if you have an immune system that's compromised, you can die from the annual flu. And a lot of people do every year, not 200,000 people like COVID, but what's the intersection in the public health realm of flu going around out there and coronavirus going around out there? And what does that mean for people who are already at risk? We haven't begun to grapple with that, but we're going to have to grapple with that. Are existing laws in the way of a public health response? Do we need to pass new laws? Do we need to try to find a way to bring funding to the table? Those are just a few of the dimensions about the public health question. A lot of us continue to be concerned about how, as we're dealing with this, can we make sure that our kids are getting the best education they can under the circumstances? I know that you both live that every day in your role as board members. So we will be continuing to grapple with those things and think about how we can support our K-12 districts. And then economically, we know that we had to cut over $3 billion from 2 fiscal years, from 1920 and 2021. And on the one hand, we just had some good numbers come out from our nonpartisan economists, but we know the worst is yet to come. We have to get through the December forecast, and then the set of numbers that we actually set the budget to next spring is the March forecast. So we got 2 more quarterly forecasts, 6 months, and a lot of uncertainty yet. before we really know what the budget looks like. I do think I can safely say, based on what I'm hearing, that the worst case, which is if there's not a sudden recovery, if we don't get a lot of federal relief, which is not looking promising right now, then we could be looking to cut another $1.5 billion from fiscal 22. And that is going to be a multiple of times hard to cut from what we already had to do, because all the easy stuff is done. The using.
So can I ask you quickly? You said you said $1.5 billion? I'm sorry.
Up to worst case, up to another $1.5 billion reduction in the state fiscal 21-2 budget below the lowered baseline. So think about the reductions we already had to make in fiscal 21 as kind of baked in. Now we've got to go find another $1.5 billion on top of that. And again, it was all painful, but the relatively easier stuff, quote unquote, was done in the sense of using excess balance from cash fund, of putting on pause or even repealing programs that hadn't really started to spin up yet. The more you have to cut, the more painful is each layer down that you have to go. With that one-time federal money, we were able to avoid even worse outcomes in terms of the state support for K-12. It could have been worse for higher ed, I'll put it that way. But two of the things that I am most concerned about, if we do have to somehow cut another $1.5 billion, is just those two. It's higher ed, it's K-12. It's some of the core things that we should be doing as a state. So, sorry, I kind of rambled on at length there, but back to your question. What are the big things? Come January, those of us who are elected or reelected, those are the big things. Dealing with COVID, both public health wise and economically. And when it comes time to the budget, I do very much believe a budget is a moral document. We have to pass a balanced budget. We know that. That's the Constitution. But we have to do that in a way that does the least harm to the least among us, and embodies our progressive values as best we can. One more thing on that, and we can explore this more if you like. We often talk in budget balancing about just the one side of the ledger, cut. And we're not going to be able to avoid that if the economic picture remains difficult. But you have to look at the other side of the ledger, so to speak, which is the many, many hundreds of millions of dollars of tax expenditures, you might call them tax loopholes, that we have had in our law, in some cases for years and decades. And are those doing what they should be doing? Now, there are things there that we want to leave there. The state version of the earned income tax credit, that supports working people, that helps people get by. Supporting childcare through the tax code, which is very expensive in Colorado. That's fine. We don't want to start taxing food. There are things that we would agree to, but then there are some other things that have been in the law for decades because somebody managed to make enough of a case in a former version of the legislature to put in there. And the question we have to ask ourselves now in this economy, in this public health crisis that we're dealing with, is that kind of incentive really the right thing that we should be doing? We can either cut another $100 million out of K-12 and higher ed, or we can go back and look at, for example, a 30-year-old $100 million tax break and decide that maybe the better thing for us to do as a state is to invest the money in our kids.
Do you have a specific tax loop that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many of them. I don't know if the Facebook connection is going to pass anything we put in the chat here out to Facebook, but the one that I was just speaking of is something called the insurance home office deduction. And I'll summarize this a bit, and then I'll say where folks can go get a whole lot more information. So you go back to 1990 or so, and let me back up. So most of us are familiar with pay and income tax, right? And if you're a corporation, you also pay income tax. If you are an insurance business, the way that we in a lot of states make sure that insurance companies are paying their fair share is through what's called an insurance premium tax. So you look at how much money is coming in by premiums and you levy a tax on that instead of income in the sense of income net of allowable deductions that is used for other businesses. Okay, fine. Another equally valid way for insurance companies to pay their share of roads and police and fire and everything that we have in society. For 30 years now, there's been a provision in the law that says if you open up an office building, a home office in Colorado, you cut that tax rate in half. The theory, I suppose, was to bring jobs to Colorado, but Our legislative auditor, which is a nonpartisan staff agency that is in the legislative branch, looked at this and they found a few things. It hasn't actually brought jobs to Colorado. You can look at states that do not have this provision, and they've had more growth of jobs in the insurance sector. Conversely, you can look at states that do have some provision like this, they've actually lost jobs, which tells you that in the insurance sector, there's a lot of other stuff going on. How good is the economy in a state? You know, if you want to attract mobile employees with skill sets, et cetera, you know, they care about quality of life. Of course, people want to come to Colorado, you know, and hike and ski and so forth. So that is one specific example that we talked about in the legislature this past year that unfortunately did not get repealed. It is still on the books, but that is $80, $90, $100 million a year to not create jobs. To look, if I'm an insurance company, of course, I want to keep getting that tax break, but that's not the conversation that the whole legislature should be having. The whole legislature needs to be having a conversation with the limited resources that we have, especially in a recession. What are the wisest ways to invest those dollars? One place that folks can go to get a whole lot more information, to see the official nonpartisan analysis of that provision that I just mentioned, and a whole lot more, is go to the state auditor and look up their tax expenditure and profile reports. You go back, I think it was before my time, I think 16 or even 15, the then legislature passed the bill that started to set up these reports. So what's been happening is for a couple of years now, the auditor staff have been taking a very detailed look at our tax code, dozens and dozens of provisions over the 3 years. These are all public reports that you can get if you want to get a PDF report on one thing. You can get that if you want to read. Here, actually, I got a hard copy here. See how thick that is? This is the 2020 compilation. So, you know, you can get that on PDF and read the whole thing if you want. I started reading it last night. I'm going to keep working on it. That is their analysis of everything over the past year. There's two more like that. There's 19 and there's 18. So that's cumulatively, that's got to be 600 pages of really taking a hard look at the tax code, what's working, what's not, and critically, how much does it cost the state? Working people, ordinary folks who just, you know, if they're lucky enough to still have a job in COVID, you go, you work at your job, you know that you're paying your share in taxes. Most of us don't have access to these special tax breaks. Mm-hmm. All the loopholes in the code are not, for the most part, there for ordinary working folks. They are there for a much smaller percentage of folks, businesses, individuals. Maybe if you've been lucky, if your business is making millions, if individually you're making millions, great. You know, God bless you. Things are relatively okay for you, it would seem. But the next question is, does the state need to then come on top of that and give preferential treatment to folks who have been lucky and are in those situations at the expense of, you know, 90, 95% of everybody else? That's the kind of way I think we need to be looking at some of these tax provisions, especially next year in the middle of a public health situation, in the middle of an economic recession situation.
So let me ask this question. Are you running unopposed?
No. So I have a Republican opponent. His name is Dustin Bishop. I think normally, you know, by this time we have been out at events, we'd have bumped into each other. We'd have said hello. This year being what it is, things being more virtualized, you know, all the events where people would have a candidate forum or the county fair or whatever pretty much been canceled. So I haven't met him in person. But no, I'm not opposed, and that's part of why I'm working hard.
And so, do you think we're on the right track right now in terms of where we're at, in terms of the laws that have been passed? And I'm thinking from the point of view of criminally and financially, two huge areas. But where would you start at, and where would you say, if we're not on the right track, where would you say is the next steps in terms of improvement between those two?
Wow. So two very big, somewhat different things. I'll take them one at a time. There's been some progress in both of those domains over the last couple of years. In a lot of cases, bipartisan progress, which is nice to see. I think there's more progress to be made. I mean, the thing with legislating, with lawmaking, is, to me, it's about keeping the laws that people live under in sync with the realities of society. So you're never done. You're never all the way there, because society is always changing. You can have, I mean, look at COVID. Like, things are pretty good in March and February, and then, we're in a situation none of us have lived in before. So in the criminal law, criminal justice space, I mean, this is an area that I've worked in all 4 years since I was first sworn in 17. We've had actually a lot of progress in this space. 217, the police reform bill that we talked about last time, gets a lot of attention this year, and rightly so. But there's also been a lot of other pretty big stuff. You go back to last year, one of the bigger bills was the defelonization, not decriminalization, but defelonization of almost all possession level offenses.
Yep.
That was a big and I think correct move in drug sentencing policy. Personally, I've worked in what I call broadly collateral consequences reduction, getting back to work, record sealing, things like this. Other legislators have done the same. In some respects, as significant as those gains have been, we still have less permissive record sealing laws than we had more than 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In 87, 88, there was a bill that went through, kind of slammed the door on most people being able to seal their records after they've done their time. Let me flag one thing, though, that's late breaking as of today, and
Yep.
I think important and interesting. You know it.
Yep.
The governor used an authority that the legislature gave him by bill at the end of our session in June, and sort of did a mass pardon of individuals with low-level marijuana offenses, 1 ounce or less. In some cases, that's going back decades, and this is a full pardon, lodging in the constitutional power of the governor as chief executive to sort of relieve the ongoing consequences under civil law of that. This was different than the usual pardon process, and that because it was a low-level offense, there didn't need to be an individual case-by-case sort of interrogation of the facts and putting together a paper record and so forth. Excuse me. So there's actually a tool that, apologize, talking too much here. CBI has a website where folks can look up. So if you know that you have a low-level or 1 ounce possession offense that happened years ago and you wonder if you're in this order, there's going to be a way where you can look yourself up. So it doesn't cover, everything. If it was a different kind of offense, if it was possession of another substance, you're not in this. I do want to flag, you might be able to seal your records individually because of a law we passed in 19. Let me go try to dig that up and drop it in the chat. I've been meaning to Facebook it too. I think it's important that we get this out there because,
Yes.
okay, it's 2,800 folks, but the issue with these priors is they might keep you from getting the best job that you can get. Now your earning is diminished. Now your ability to support a family is diminished. Now we're not talking about 2,700 people. It might be a multiple of that. Next steps in sort of evolution of criminal justice, I think, is to continue to look at sentencing. There is something going on now called the Sentencing Reform Task Force, which is a subunit, if you will, of CCJJ, the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. That organization has been around 12 some years, gets reauthorized every couple of years. I ran the bill to reauthorize it in 18. The governor annually sends a letter to CCJJ, kind of giving them some direction. So what happened in this year's letter, which if I remember right was dated late June, was directing a comprehensive look at our sentencing laws. Which, as to the presumptive ranges, were doubled in the 1980s. There hasn't really been a revisitation of that policy move in 35 years. We know that there are provisions in the code that can significantly multiply even what the presumptive ranges are. So there's specific direction in that letter from the governor to CCJJ to look at habitual sentencing, to look at extraordinary risk sentencing and certain other things that can send people away for what I would call a de facto life sentence. You didn't do a felony one. You weren't actually sentenced to life. But by the time you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and you get 96 years, and this happened and was written up in the Denver Post a couple of years ago, it's de facto life. So too early to say what's going to come of that, but discussions are ongoing. I'm personally hopeful that there will be a bill that will put some sanity back into sentencing. I mean, look, people sometimes do really terrible, twisted things out there in the world. There needs to be a price for that. But we need to make sure that the right people are paying the right price, doing an amount of time that is commensurate with the offense that they did. We also need to remember that, there's a cost to all of us for the current system, and it's verging on $1 billion a year. Okay, look, there are people who need to be put away for a while because they are a threat. But when we lock somebody up, it's about $40,000 a year. And particularly where we're locking up older folks, maybe who've already done a couple of decades, the state's on the hook for those medical bills. And we all tend to be less well when we're older, particularly those inside, which is not necessarily a healthy environment. So it's not unheard of that there's going to be 6 digits of medical bills for the oldest, most unwell inmates, who frankly, a lot of the time may not be able to be a risk to public safety if they wanted to be. So that's how the numbers add up. That's how you get to spending $1 billion on locking folks up. And query whether, again, in the context of being in a recession, if we could bring some sanity to our sentencing laws, maybe even look at expanded use of compassionate release parole for folks who are inside, who are older, who are less of a risk, who've done decades of time, who maybe are at risk of catching COVID and passing away from it, and that's not something that they were sentenced to. And we can try to contain the fiscal cost as well as the human cost of the system.
Well, speaking of criminal justice reform, I remember in the last few years that transforming safety legislation passed, and that made a big change in the criminal justice atmosphere. And I know you and Senator Ron DeFelice and so many others were pivotal in making sure that got through. What do you think is on the forefront if we actually have, because hopefully we're going to be getting rid of George Brockler, our current district attorney, and hopefully we'll have a Democratic district attorney. What new gains do you think you'll have in the criminal justice reform world if we get, let's just say, Amy Patton, who I'm pulling for, as our next district attorney?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up because, we don't talk enough about the role of discretion in the criminal justice system. We want there to be discretion. I mean, people in my position, legislators, cannot foresee every single thing that's going to happen and write it out on the books in black and white exactly what should happen. There's discretion all the way from stop to arrest or not, to charge or not, to plea or not, to all the way down, all the way to the very end, to parole. Do you get discretionary parole or not? So there should be discretion, but that discretion needs to be exercised the right way by the right people. So DA Brockler is term limited out. We're going to have a new DA one way or the other, and certainly there's a spirited contest going on there. I think one of the key things is where do we see diversionary dispositions or not? I mean, that is an example of a tremendous amount of discretion being vested in the prosecutor. Do you offer that diversionary pathway or not? Do you do it pre-file, or do you file charges and then you do basically a different kind of diversion where somebody sort of has the charge hanging over their head? There are folks who feel that shifts the power balance in those discussions, and I think rightly so. In the Aurora part of the 18th, we have a lot of conversations about school to prison and the role that getting trapped up in excessive discipline in the school context, maybe getting routed into municipal truancy court. I know from conversations with people in the 18th, your eligibility for diversionary disposition in the youth adjudication track depends on priors. And you look around the 18th, you look at all the different school districts, not everybody gets trapped up in municipal truancy court equally. So what you have happening is folks getting sort of differentially made not available for diversionary dispositions at the district level in terms of youth offenses. That I think is a problem. A lot of facets to that problem, state and local, possibly at the 18th as well. But again, just if I had to bring it back to one thing, it's just that powerful amount of discretion lodged in the office of the DA and who's going to exercise it and according to what values. A couple other ones, like do you pursue habitual charges? Like what kind of plea do you offer? We know that 95% or so of things get pled out, plus or minus, depending on the type of offense and the jurisdiction. But there's a lot of power there. How is that power used?
Habitual yeah, and I'm sorry, habituals have been used as a weapon in order to force certain pleas, and they may not necessarily be the best pleas, but that has definitely been an issue as well.
And complicity laws.
Oh, don't get me started on complicity laws as well. That's even worse. I'm sorry, Mike. That's even worse.
Let's clarify that for the lay people. Yes. What are we talking about here?
Well, complicity in the state of Colorado basically says that you can be charged with the exact same crime as another. All it requires is that someone committed all or most of the crime, and that you either abated, abetted, assisted in some way, or in some sense, in instances, acquiesced and did nothing, but yet stood by and watched.
Was there.
Or
being in the
just
vicinity.
being there.
Yeah.
Complicity is a terrible law, quite frankly, Mike, because people can get the same sentence as the person who actually did it. So you have that. Complicity is equivalent to felony murder in a sense, because felony murder in the state of Colorado, and I've had a couple felony murder cases where I actually had a client who he and a friend decided they were going to go commit a armed robbery of a liquor store. And then my client said, nope, I'm not. Turns around, leaves, runs back to his house, but his partner, if you will, continued to go in, commit the actual crime. They got in a tussle over the gun. The liquor store owner gets shot and dies. My client, who was obviously not there, who changed his mind, was charged with felony murder in that case. So that's felony murder. Essentially, complicity is essentially the same thing in that aspect. And they're used as weapons in the state of Colorado. In other words, if you don't accept this offer, we're going to hit you with complicity, or we're going to hit you with, we're going to hit you with habituals. But I know that Stefania wanted to
modern day
add in
slavery.
Yeah, it is.
It absolutely is. It's a way to round up the many for the one. It's just modern day slavery that needs to go away. Most countries and states have done away with felony murder. They've taken it off the books. They realize it is unconstitutional to charge somebody that does not have the mens rea or the actus rea to complete this crime, and yet it remains on the books here in Colorado.
There was a bill. This was one of the casualties of COVID. A lot of bills were not able to continue. Not too long before, maybe it was early March, but not too long before we had to break for public health reasons. There was a bill introduced to reform, albeit not totally eliminate, the felony murder doctrine from Colorado. That was, I'm going to go check the number. Was it 191? Senate Bill 191. So this was introduced by Senator Pete Lee, who's chair of Senate Judiciary. I would have been the House sponsor had it come over to the House. It just wasn't able to proceed through the Senate. But this is something that some of us have been looking at for a long time for the reasons that you stated, that it amounts to a life sentence for somebody where it is not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they did the offense.
And continuing on that criminal justice track, I've just been following Amy Patton's campaign very closely, and she's been talking about creating a community outreach office. How big do you think that could be when it comes to getting rid of some of these blind spots? When it comes to getting rid of some of these blind spots that we have in our criminal justice system, and I don't want to badmouth George Brockler too much, but I think there was room for improvement, right? And to say the least. How big do you think an improvement that can be when it comes to listening to your faith community, when it comes to listening to your school boards and your elected officials and just community activists about what's not going right?
Thematically, which I think is how you mean, it could be quite big. We are a jurisdiction of 1 million+ people in the 18th. In a few more years, Arapahoe County will be its own judicial district. We'll be pushing 750,000 just in this county by that time. To tie it back to transforming safety, so you look in the four corners of the bill, what happened? Okay, some changes were made to how long you serve on parole revocations, and the savings were used in an interesting way. But that's too small a view of what that bill was about. To me, part of what made that bill significant and why it has galvanized a lot of interest and involvement in North Aurora, and I'm sure in the other target community, Southeast Colorado Springs, it was about it was like the bill says, taking another vision of public safety, getting upstream of the conditions that can lead to criminal activity, trying to create opportunity, community opportunity, business opportunity in areas where there hasn't been any. So by analogy, to the idea of an outreach office, it would have to, the funding of it would have to get figured out. The right people would have to be hired, but if the goal is not just to promote public safety in the way that we've seen in the second half of the 20th century, which is, incarceration and heavy policing, particularly in certain communities, I think there's a lot of room here. You could try to build bridges with the faith community. You could try to enlist faith leaders. I mean, you guys all know Pastor Thomas Mays. I'm sure I've had some real interesting, candid conversations with him about, what it is or is not to just have the right positive kind of role model in your life, in the life of a young person who may not have a lot of stability for a whole mix of reasons. I mean, everybody in and outside of law enforcement should be interested in putting together the building blocks of that kind of society where people have the right mentors, people have the right folks they can turn to, so they don't maybe end up running with folks who are going to be a bad influence instead. So, it would be great to see the new district attorney, and obviously I'm supporting Amy Padden too. It would be great to see the new district attorney take that tack, because there's hardly a better district in all of Colorado to try that out in than the 18th, and particularly in Aurora.
So it's along the lines of reform and sticking with policing, I know that Senator Rhonda Fields has written a new House bill that just got passed. I believe it's 107, 117.
217 was the big police reform bill. Yeah.
It goes into reforming, how policing is handled. How there's a lot still needs to be done. We have now on the bill, on the ballot, or coming up, they're wanting to get rid of ketamine. And they're wanting to do some real reform in the police, in the police stations. How do you see that going? What do you see? What would you like to see happen so that we don't have these incidents that cause all this unrest?
Yeah, a couple of things. Definitely a lot of us, I think all of us in the Aurora delegation have been involved to some extent or another in some version of the ketamine conversation. And I don't yet know where a bill is going to go, but, from my perspective, this is a criminal justice issue, sitting as a chair of judiciary. Dr. Michael St-Jeannet, who represents the district where Mr. McLean was ultimately killed, is vice chair of public health. That's the committee that oversees CDPHE, which is the entity that does the ketamine waivers. You have Dominique Jackson on the Health and Insurance Committee. You have Senator Fields on the Senate Public Health Committee. You have my colleague up in Adams County, excuse me, Dr. Yadira Caraveo, who's coming at this from a professional context. So you have a lot of us looking at how ketamine is used, what are the waiver process, is that adequately tight? I would say no, it's not. This is a new thing, I think, within the last 10 years that the first responder agencies have been using this in this way with these consequences. I think it was KUNC, maybe it was public radio that had the reporting, something like 17, 18% of people who are injected with ketamine end up intubated at a hospital.
Wow.
This may be kind of a strange comparison to say, but 17, 18% of people who get COVID do not end up intubated at a hospital. So just to kind of tie two things together in the world that are going on right now. So I think we need to look at that. At the same time, as we look at that, I think we need to be careful to not create sort of unintended consequences. If more tasers are getting used, and we know that those can lead to strokes and irregular heart conditions, we don't want to substitute tasers for ketamine. We do not want to substitute live rounds for ketamine. We do not want to substitute physical holds and restraints and so forth for ketamine. So I think part of it is looking at ketamine, and I'm using that as a shorthand for a whole class of drugs that might be used in a similar way. We don't want to just be about that one substance, but we also need to look more philosophically at the nature of response, who rolls out in response to what kind of thing. I was glad to see some interest from the city in starting to pilot, at least in a small way, the co-responder model. They're looking to the CAHOOTS program that some of us are familiar with out of Oregon. Sometimes maybe a criminal response is needed, but what the teaching of CAHOOTS is that if somebody's in a mental health crisis, you need to roll a mental health professional out to visit with that person.
Yes.
Somebody with that kind of training who doesn't necessarily present as a law enforcement officer, might have jeans and a polo shirt, So we should see where that program goes. And I know it's only pilot. I know dollars are tight for the city, but I would like to see this get stood up. I think if you look at the costs of what it is to sort of respond in the usual ways, you do that kind of thing, right? You might actually save money, certainly better human outcomes in the long term. Oh boy. So ketamine is only part of it. Another thing that has come to light, very closely related to the McLean situation, is the cause of death investigation. There's been some reporting about certain communications that happened around the coroner's office that I consider very problematic. And I think we need to look at all the laws about open records and who is permissibly allowed to communicate with whom in a context like that. And I tie it back to the same root philosophy of 217, which is the public needs to be able to have trust and confidence in what law enforcement is doing. When there is a police-community interaction that leads to death, the public needs to be able to have absolute confidence in the coroner's cause of death determination. And there's been some reporting to put a little bit more doubt on that in the case of Mr. McLean than I think a lot of us would like to see. So I expect that we'll have some conversations about that, and probably a lot more. I mean, there's been a lot of activity in the criminal justice space. There are lots of us who work on these issues, and there are even some Republicans who want to work on these issues too. You look at the city council, we've had strong interest in these issues from Republican Curtis Darden. That's good to see,
That's good.
Well, let me ask you this. Those are all really good reactive tools that are at our disposal. What are we doing proactively, especially in the area of making sure that the police officers who are good at their jobs and want to be good at their jobs have the opportunity to do that? I'm sure that they did not become a police officer hoping that they were getting into a field that they were disrespected or no one viewed them as, a real public safety, person. So how do we get back to hiring the right types of police officers, getting rid of the bad actors that are now in that field, and making sure that in that field, if there are some, they are absolutely held accountable, or at least have some sort of enticement to make them continue to maintain, to act in a good fashion?
Thank you for the question. I mean, it's absolutely the flip side of everything else we're talking about, and we do have to address both sides. And frankly, as hard as it is to grapple with and fix the problems that we have, and sort of in terms of the accountability of the officers who do the wrong thing, it's almost harder to answer the question you just asked because it's sort of broader. But a few things. My colleague James Coleman, Rep. Coleman, who's going to be Senator Coleman going into next year, has worked on this issue over the years in terms of police officer mental health. He has tried to bring grant funding to the equation. Just talking about it, helps destigmatize. Look, it is a job with a higher than normal risk of post-traumatic stress, just from what you do, from getting shot at, from going into a situation where you might get shot at. I mean, I think we all have to acknowledge that. And then, somebody who is walking around with unprocessed post-traumatic stress, I dropped the D, I dropped the disorder advisedly. We don't want folks like that responding to calls. That's potentially a volatile situation. So, we have to make sure that there's adequate support for that. Peer support is one model. A police department as big enough as Aurora, Denver may be able to do it internally. What does it look like for smaller departments? I know a lady who has volunteered to go do like massage therapy, for officers as a form of stress relief. So that's part of it. Part of it, frankly, is making sure that people are paid a livable salary. Cost of housing is going up for police officers, just like it is everything else. Something I hear repeatedly around here is we get out competed in Aurora by Denver. Folks go through academy here, maybe they do a couple of years. Denver, for whatever mix of reasons, bigger tax base, is able to offer a better salary. So officers are getting hired away. They're officers in Denver. That keeps us from building a core of folks with the community ties and investment that I think we would want doing police work here. Another part of it, and this kind of getting back to the first one of making sure that folks are taken care of so we can keep the right kind of folks, is issues in the workers' compensation system. We were able to address this in sort of a tiny way this year in terms of the 911 operators who are exposed in an auditory way to awful things that could trigger post-traumatic stress, but the law was not written in terms of auditory only exposure, so that had to be fixed. Those are a few things. Making sure that the retirement benefit is adequate. For example, public pensions often come under attack.
I think we're thinking of two different things here. What I'm looking to hear is, for instance, in the nursing field, if one person in an operating room makes a mistake, the surgeon, everybody in the room can be sued. Everybody goes down. If one police officer makes a mistake, and there's 3 or 4 of them that join in, and we've all seen the tapes where one police officer makes a call, 16 of them show up, and none of them ask what's really going on. They all just start reacting. Mm-hmm. None of them assess the situation. None of them ask any questions other than what he's called in, and they all just start pouncing on this, reacting in a negative way. How do we stop that from happening over and over again? For instance, maybe there's insurance that they have to pay for that says, per incident, I have to carry this much insurance, especially since the taxpayers are covering these lawsuits these civil lawsuits that come in. The parents of Breonna Taylor, they're paying they got a $12 million lawsuit. That's their money. They paid into that system, and they're just now getting it back. That's all. The police officers are not paying for it. The city, it's coming out of the city's money, which is paid for by the taxpayers. So how do we make police officers accountable for their own mistakes? As a nurse, I would be accountable for any kind of mistake that I made. I have to carry liability insurance. That liability insurance follows me everywhere I go. If I continue to make mistakes, a liability insurance company is going to say, you're uninsurable. I cannot insure you. So same thing with a police officer. If they continue to make mistakes, then they can't be insured. Perhaps that's a way of weeding out those bad apples and saying, you can't have this kind of a job and have this type of responsibility with a weapon if you can't be insured. And the insurance companies have called you a liability.
Yeah, look, I appreciate the analogy to the nursing profession. And Marcus and I are in the same situation as attorneys. I'm not actively practicing right now. I'm a full-time legislator, but if you're an attorney in private practice, you need to have liability insurance. And under our professional rules, like the ones that you're under, I can be on the hook for my own screw-ups. I can also be on the hook for failing to properly supervise an associate under me, or if I see something really bad going on by, even a partner in the firm, I have an independent ethical duty under attorney ethics to report if I see obvious fraud going on, for example, and that backs up on liability insurance. So part of what you're talking about is the idea on top of whatever independent oversight there is, the scrutiny of the press, the scrutiny of lawmakers, you want to get the sort of brass tacks way of looking at things that an insurance company is going to bring to bear on the situation, working in the right direction, working as the right kind of incentive. I think we started down this road with 2 provisions of 217, which is addressing qualified immunity and creating, for the first time, in some cases at least, personal financial responsibility in a civil judgment that might arise. Also, in another part of the bill is the creation of a statutory duty to intervene. So if inappropriate use of force is going on, and you're the first officer on the scene, Marcus is the second officer on the scene, if he fails to basically stop you from doing what you shouldn't be doing in the first place, now you're on the hook, and potentially so is he. So, those provisions are both so new. We collectively, as a state, as a legal system, as a political system, we don't really have a lot of experience with those yet. But, I would like to say that I hope we never do, because I hope these things don't keep happening. But I think that may be a bit much to wish for. As they continue to happen, we are going to see these provisions come into play, and I hope that the press helps surface them, because they're very worthy of discussion, being new and topical. Is the way the duty to intervene statute is written, is that sufficient to capture everything that we want, or does the legislature need to look at that again? How is the provision of the bill working to get rid of qualified immunity that has really shielded a lot of conduct in this space for 10 years since the Supreme Court really gummed up the doctrine. How is that working? Is it working well enough? Those were some very big moves, and I think needed moves in 217, and we'll see if we have to build on them.
So we're kind of getting close to the end. So as we did for our last visit with another candidate, we kind of shoot a little bit of speed rounds,
lightning round.
All right.
And hopefully that'll give Stefania and Kevin a little time to think of a question. So let me ask you some questions, or a couple questions. What makes you different from your opponent at this stage? Why should the people in your House district vote for you for another term?
Okay. A rule I have is I don't like to talk a lot of smack about my opponent, so I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. But I work really hard. I give this everything I've got because I think it demands nothing less. This year has flipped over how we usually do campaigns, but I believe in getting out there, trying to be accessible to people and hear what people want to say, even if I disagree with it. So we are continuing to go door to door. We're not knocking and trying to invite those long conversations, even as much as I like them. We are leaving newsletters. So I do this report. You guys have seen it, summarizing the highlights of what we do every year. It has my contact information on the front. Like I was saying earlier, we have visited more than 15,000 doors in the district to make that information available, to make my contact information available. We're going to keep doing that right up until Election Day. We can't do the in-person town halls anymore because of COVID, so we're doing them on Zoom. My very next one is actually 2 days from now, first Saturday every month. We're going to be talking about the ballot measures. We got lots of hugely consequential stuff coming up this year. I think it goes with the territory to make yourself available. As far as in the session part of the year, and this is a 12-month, 365, 24/7 job to me. Well, I got to sleep a little bit, but I am one of the first people down there in the building every morning. I'm one of the last people out every night. If I got to be up till past 12 to read and be prepared for what I have to vote on the next day, I do that. This is the greatest honor and privilege I feel like I've ever had of anything I've done in my life. So I give it everything I've got because it deserves no less, and the people who voted for me deserve no less, and frankly, the people who didn't vote for me deserve no less too.
Do you think Tabor is a good thing?
No, so Tabor is almost 30 years old here, and no other state has it, and it has massively handcuffed our ability to solve problems. I'll try to be short. I think public policy is about solving problems, and Tabor makes it harder to do that.
Do you have any special plan for the Black community in particular?
I think what I would start by saying is I was born with one of these and two of these, and notwithstanding the amount of talking I feel like I've been doing here the last hour on the show, as a person who was born Anglo, I got to start by listening. I have to know that I will never know fully what it is like to walk in your shoes, for example, what it is like to be followed around a store, to the things I could tell you that my colleagues, my state legislative elected colleagues who've done the work to get elected to the same job that I have done, John Buckner, Janet Buckner, Jovan Mountain, everybody in the Black Caucus. I've heard things that but they're horrible, and nobody should have to experience them. And as much as I hear, it's not the same as having to live it. So I just have to be humble. I have to listen. I have to be available. I have to be open to, critique. Maybe I'm not doing a good enough job, and try to build from there.
What would you say to the 25-year-old who's very intelligent, very connected right now, but hugely disenfranchised politically? How would you draw in that vote? What would you say to the 25-year-old, that age group that really needs to get out there and vote, and maybe sitting on the edge and not wanting? What would you say to them?
Good question.
Great question, especially now. The first thing that comes to mind is don't give up hope. We all care about different things. Whether you care about police reform, whether you care about investing in K-12 education, higher education, just to take some of the things we talked about tonight, climate change, just immigration issues, war and peace. I mean,
Democracy.
democracy itself, access to the ballot, the franchise, voter intimidation, politics, and who's elected has something to do with all of those. Whatever you care about, the political process is going to touch it, maybe in ways you don't even appreciate. So, honor the sacrifice that everybody over the centuries has made to expand the right to vote to where it is, particularly in Colorado. I wish it were as open in other states, and make yourself heard. No candidate is everything to everyone. I don't pretend I'm everything to everyone. Anybody who says they are, is not being honest with you. So that said, there are some very clear distinctions to be had, especially at the very top of the ticket this year. And Kevin, to your last point, the basic mechanism of representative government, of small d democracy, is on the line in this election. So maybe you don't love everything about everyone, or maybe you're still learning, but don't sit it out. Do participate. Do vote for people who will uphold basic decency in office, and then go get in their face. Track down an email. Track down, a cell phone, an office phone. I get Facebook messages. I deal with constituents in many, many different ways, like we all have to right now. So, voting is the start, but voting does not need to be the end. Contact your elected officials. The closer to home, the smaller the jurisdiction, the more you're going to be heard. I mean, I answer the overwhelming percentage of my constituent email myself. I do have some help from a legislative aid, but people are emailing me. I feel it's important that they hear back from me as much as possible. So don't give up. Like there are forces out there that want you to give up. There are forces out there too that want you to believe that D versus R doesn't matter. It does matter. It really matters right now.
Okay, well, tell the viewers where your district, the boundaries of your district, and when and how to vote, and we'll wrap it up on you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. So I represent House District 36, which is roughly the easternmost parts of Aurora, some unincorporated Arapahoe County. Very roughly, we start on the west at Chambers Road. We go past 470. We go to the very east edge of the city, so we border on Watkins. On the north, we are at Colfax Ave. We go south all the way down to Smoky Hill Road. It's kind of like a bite out where we butt up on House District 40. How to vote. So county clerks are going to start sending out mail ballots a week from tomorrow, October 9th. They're going to be put into the mail over the course of several days. A county as big as Arapahoe, we don't necessarily get all 400+ thousand ballots in the mail in one day. But sometime by about the end of that week following, say the 15th or 16th or so, you should have your ballot. It'll come in an envelope about that big. If you are a first-time voter, you might need to make a photocopy of your driver's license and send it back. There's going to be instructions. The nice thing about getting it in advance is you have time to research candidates like me, ballot issues, judges. There's some links that we could share on all of that. And then you have options to send it back. You can drop it off in the secure drop boxes. We got around here, we got one at the DMV, one at the city building, one at the library. Personally, I seem to end up dropping it off at a library. You can mail it early this year. Make sure you put adequate postage on it. If for some reason you don't get a ballot, like you moved recently, didn't update your address, a dog eats the ballot, you actually chuck it out with the recycling, whatever, don't worry, you have not lost your right to vote. The system in Colorado has contingencies for that. You can do one of two things. If it's early enough in the voting period, you could get them to send you a replacement mail ballot. If you go on the website and update your address, a little bit more of a surefire thing to do and faster is go to an in-person location. Fully, we call it a VSPC, or Voter Service and Polling Center. We'll have those all over the county too. And you can go in and say, hey, I didn't get a ballot. They'll make sure your information is up to date in the computer system. They'll check you off. So there's no voting twice fear. That's all silly. And you have a ballot. It's the same ballot as you would have got through the mail. If you know what you want to do, you can fill it out. You can vote it right then and there, give it back to them. Or if time permits, you can take it home, drop it off later. Key thing, your ballot has to be back by 7 p.m. on election day. Postmark is not enough. Mm-hmm. So if it gets up to right at the end, November 1, November 2, please do not mail your ballot. Take it to an in-person location. One last thing. Some folks, maybe car is broken, elderly, disabled, don't want to go out because of COVID. In Colorado, you have the right to vote your ballot by giving it to somebody that you trust to drop it off for you. So suppose, I busted my leg, I can't move, I can't drive. Hopefully not, I got more doors to walk. I could, call my friend Kevin and say, hey, Kevin, can you help me out? I got my ballot. Can you run it down to the box for me? Kevin can come over. I'm allowed to give him my ballot, and he's helping me vote. That is a right that I have under the law, with the limitation that Kevin can't do that more than 10 times in a cycle.
Yep.
So you sometimes hear this term ballot harvesting. There is no such term. It does not mean anything in the law. Bluntly, that kind of talk is to try to disenfranchise people out of getting a little bit of help that they might need to cast their votes. I actually saw a few days ago in Arizona, they made a law that felonizes helping somebody vote that way. Now, that is one of the more messed up things I've heard in a while, but we don't have that in Colorado. We have it where you can get some help from somebody to cast your ballot if you're older, disabled, et cetera, et cetera. So just good option for folks to remember as well.
Well, Mike, really just want to say thank you. It is always an honor. And we just want to say thank you for definitely always accepting our invitation. And it's just always a pleasure to kind of get that insight of where things are headed. If you haven't guessed it, we are supportive of you. We are square within House District 36. So definitely a pleasure as always. And I look forward to voting for you, quite frankly, as well. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much for making the time and for an intense conversation. Stefani, I hope that when circumstances are better, we all get to meet in person sometime as well. Appreciate your view on these issues too.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you and good night, everybody.
Have a good night.
Getting money like cash, get the money like a cashier. Benjamin, nothing less. I was broke, never last year. Don't change 'em. I never switched up.